Night fell over the city of Brooksville, casting ominous shadows on the empty streets. It was a Friday night, and Sarah was exhausted after a long week of work. She was 25 years old, with dark hair and deep brown eyes. Her life was quiet and routine, and she lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Sarah had just finished dinner and was taking advantage of the tranquility of the night to relax. Light rain lapped against the windows, creating a soothing soundtrack for your reading. She was engrossed in her book when she heard a strange sound coming from upstairs. It was as if something had fallen or been knocked over. She raised her head, frowning curiously. It wasn't a windy night, so the sound couldn't be attributed to strong wind. The rain outside continued its steady melody, but the sound upstairs didn't fit. She hesitated for a moment, trying to dismiss the idea that it could be an intruder. However, when the sound repeated, this time louder, fear began to creep into his heart. She knew she couldn't ignore it. He slowly got up from the sofa, keeping the book in his hand as if he could use it as a weapon if necessary. With cautious steps, he climbed the stairs that led to the upper floor. Every creaking of the floorboards sounded like thunder in his ears. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped for a moment, listening intently. It was clear that the sound was coming from his room, the last one on the right of the hallway. He never left the door open, and a chill ran down his spine when he saw that the door was ajar. Sarah slowly pushed the door open, revealing the darkness of her room. She hesitated at the entrance, taking in the state of the room. The drawers were overturned, clothes were scattered on the floor, and personal items were broken. Someone had broken into his house. Butterflies invaded her stomach when she realized she wasn't alone. The door closed behind her with a bang, and before she could react, something covered her face. The odor of the cloth was strong, and she felt immediately dizzy. She tried to fight, but her legs gave way and she lost consciousness. Hours later, when he woke up, he was in a completely unfamiliar place. His eyes slowly opened in the darkness, and his head throbbed. When she tried to move her hands, she realized she was tied to a chair. The reality of her situation hit her like a punch. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she was able to make out some shapes around her. It seemed to be some kind of basement, damp and cold. The walls were damp and moldy, and the only source of light was a dim lamp hanging from the ceiling. She tried to scream, but a cloth was gagging her mouth. His heart was racing, and panic began to set in. He tried to remember what had happened, how he had gotten there, but his memories were cloudy. A hoarse voice echoed in the darkness. "You're finally awake." It was a man, but Sarah couldn't see his face in the dim light. "You know, Sarah, you're about to find out what happens when someone breaks into my house." Sarah's eyes widened in terror when she heard the hoarse voice of the man who was hiding in the shadows. She tried to respond, but the cloth gagging her made it impossible to make any sound. His heart was beating wildly as he tried to understand what was happening. The man approached slowly, becoming visible in the dim light of the lamp hanging from the ceiling. He was tall and thin, wearing dirty and torn clothes. His face was partially hidden by a scraggly beard, and his eyes looked empty and inhuman. "You're gonna pay for breaking into my house," he whispered with a sadistic smile on his lips. His eyes stared at Sarah as if they were about to devour her. He held a sharp knife in his hand, the blade shining dimly in the dim light. Sarah tried to move her hands, but the restraints were tight. She was defenseless, unable to escape or defend herself. Her mind worked frantically, trying to find a way out, but fear paralyzed her. The man stepped closer, the knife glowing dangerously. He traced the blade through the air, as if relishing the terror he was causing. Sarah could smell mold and dirt mixed with the metallic odor of the knife. She closed her eyes tightly, imagining the worst. However, before the man could attack her, a loud noise echoed through the captivity, causing him to flinch. He looked around, confused and irritated, as the sound continued, seeming closer and closer. Suddenly, the captivity door opened violently, and a team of men and women wearing police uniforms entered. The team leader, Detective Miller, held his gun tightly, ready for any confrontation. The kidnapper, still confused, tried to advance with his knife, but was immediately disarmed by Detective Miller. Other officers tended to Sarah, cutting her bonds and removing the gag from her mouth. Sarah was terrified but relieved at the same time. She couldn't believe the police arrived in time to save her. his heart beat wildly as he watched the kidnapper, now handcuffed and under the control of the law. Detective Miller approached Sarah and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said gently. "We got him. You're going to be fine." Sarah felt tears run down her face as she finally realized she was out of imminent danger. She didn't know how the police got there or what motivated the kidnapper, but she was grateful to be alive. The police team took the kidnapper and Sarah out of captivity, where an ambulance was waiting to check their health. Sarah was weak and dizzy, but she knew she was on her way to safety. As she was being led to the ambulance, she looked back and saw the kidnapper being placed in a police car, handcuffed and defeated. She wondered what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time. The nightmare was far from over, but Sarah was grateful to be alive and safe. She knew she had a long road ahead of her to recover from the trauma she had experienced, but at least she had a second chance to start her life over. Sarah was sitting in a police station waiting room, wrapped in a blanket provided by the rescue team. The shock and trauma of the kidnapping still haunted her, but she was grateful to be in a safe place. Detective Miller, a middle-aged man with an experienced eye, sat next to her. He wanted to make sure Sarah was okay before he started questioning her about last night's events. "Are you feeling better?" the detective asked gently. Sarah nodded, still feeling weak but more emotionally stable. "Thank you for saving me. I don't know how the police got there in time." Detective Miller smiled slightly. "It's part of our job. We're here to protect and serve. Now, when you feel ready, would you like to tell us what happened?" Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that fateful night. She described the strange sound she heard, the invasion of her home, and the moment she woke up in captivity. She also mentioned the kidnapper and the knife he was holding, as well as the panic she felt. Detective Miller listened intently, making notes in his notebook. He was determined to gather all the information needed to bring the kidnapper to justice. As Sarah spoke, Detective Miller realized something wasn't right. The kidnapping seemed extremely personal and meticulously planned, which raised suspicions about the motive behind the attack. He knew there was more to the story than met the eye. After the interview, Detective Miller left Sarah in the care of an officer while he and his team began investigating the kidnapper and the captivity where she had been held. The investigation led to an unexpected discovery. The kidnapper, whose name was Richard Barnes, had an extensive criminal history that included violent crimes and mental disorders. However, the investigation team could not find a direct connection between him and Sarah. At the same time, Sarah was recovering with support from friends and family. She began attending therapy sessions to deal with the trauma of the kidnapping, but she couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to investigate on her own, going through her belongings looking for clues. That's when he found an anonymous letter in his mail. The letter was handwritten and had no sender, just an address and a date. Sarah was intrigued and decided to follow the lead. She discovered that the address corresponded to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. The date was for the next day. With renewed courage, Sarah decided to visit the house in the hope of finding answers as to why she had been kidnapped. She knew she was entering unknown territory, but her determination drove her forward. The following afternoon, Sarah arrived at the abandoned house, observing it cautiously. It was in ruins, with broken windows and peeling walls. Light rain continued to fall, creating a gloomy atmosphere around them. As Sarah entered the house, she realized something was terribly wrong. There was a feeling that she was being watched, an ominous presence that hung in the air. She was alone in the abandoned house, and fear began to take over her. While exploring the dark rooms, Sarah discovered a secret door that led to a basement. She hesitated, but curiosity and determination compelled her to descend. The basement was even darker and damp, and the musty smell was overpowering. When she turned on a flashlight she had brought with her, Sarah saw something that made her shiver. There were a series of photographs hanging on the basement walls. They were photos of her, taken secretly while she was at home, working, hanging out with friends. Someone had been watching her closely for a long time. Shock overcame her when she realized that the kidnapping was directly related to someone who knew her, someone who had invaded her life in an insidious way. She was determined to uncover the truth and bring this attacker to justice. Sarah was paralyzed with fear and shock at the photos she had found in the basement of the abandoned house. The images were a complete invasion of her privacy. showing that someone had been watching her closely for an extended period of time. She knew it was a crucial part of the investigation, and that she needed to tell Detective Miller about her discovery. Sarah hurriedly left the basement, her mind full of questions and fears. She could hardly believe that someone so close to her, someone who knew her movements and routine so well, could be involved in her kidnapping. She felt betrayed and vulnerable. Upon arriving at the police station, Sarah immediately sought out Detective Miller and told him all about the photos found. He listened carefully and asked to see the images, which she had photographed with her cell phone before leaving the abandoned house. As he examined the photos, Detective Miller frowned. "This is very worrying, Sarah. It could be an important clue to finding out who was behind your kidnapping." The investigation team began analyzing the photos in detail, looking for clues that could lead to the attacker. They discovered that the photos were recent and showed intimate moments in Sarah's life. Someone had been watching her closely, studying her every move. The investigation led to some shocking discoveries. It was clear that the attacker was no stranger. This was someone who had direct access to Sarah's life. Investigators interviewed people close to her, including friends, coworkers, and neighbors. The team soon focused their attention on one name, Mark, a coworker of Sarah's. He worked in the same office as her, and, despite being friendly, he had always seemed a little strange. Co-workers began to notice that he knew too much about Sarah's life and often observed her. The clues began to fall into place when investigators discovered that Mark had a history of undiagnosed mental disorders and an obsessive interest in Sarah. They called him in for questioning, and after hours of pressure, Mark finally admitted his obsession. He confessed that he had broken into Sarah's house that night, intending to kidnap her and hold her hostage in a secret hideout. He claimed that he was in love with her and that he believed the only way to win her was to keep her captive until she loved him back. Detective Miller was shocked by Mark's confession and his complete lack of remorse. He knew that Mark would need psychiatric treatment, but also that he would be brought to justice for the crimes he committed. Sarah, although relieved to finally know the kidnapper's identity, was still traumatized by the experience. She continued to attend therapy to deal with the trauma and sense of violation the attacker caused in her life. The nightmare had come to an end, and Sarah was determined to start her life over again. She moved cities, found a new job, and began to rebuild herself. The experience made her stronger and more resilient, and she learned to value the security and privacy that were previously taken for granted. Detective Miller and his team ensured that Mark was committed to a mental institution, where he would receive proper treatment for his disorders. Justice was being served, and Sarah could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Despite all the difficulties and traumas she faced, Sarah was determined to move forward and not let the past define her life. She had found the strength to recover and was determined to start over, leaving the nightmare of the kidnapping behind and looking towards a brighter, safer future.